When it comes to power scaling, Dragon Ball Heroes and Xenoverse are two very misunderstood pieces of media, and I've used to scale them at a pretty high level until I got into the Xeno power scaling and saw the full context behind everything. With this said, let's start with the video. A little disclaimer, for Heroes I will only be using the Dark Demon Realm mission, the Universe mission, the Big Bang mission and the Ultra God mission. These are not only the latest hero missions, but they are also the only ones with anime and manga adaptations, and more than that, the older ones such as the original missions, the Galaxy mission and the God mission are not fully localized. And admittedly, I haven't seen any good feeds for them to begin with, so there's that. Now, as far as the continuity goes, it's important to understand that Heroes and Xenoverse are two entirely separate continuities. They follow different stories, different events, and they contradict one another, and we know that they are not simply two different timelines in the same canon, as it's stated that no matter how many timelines there are, then there is only one version of the Supreme Kai of Time. This means that there are two entirely separate canons. For the cosmology, much like in the anime and manga, both Heroes and Xenoverse contain the 12 macrocosm, the War of the Void, and in addition the Time Chasm, which is a space that separates from the timelines, with a separate flow of time. There is the Time Nest, which is contained at the edge of the timeline or the edge of the universe, depending on how you interpret Chrono's statement. As for the number of timelines, we need to understand how timelines are made in both of them. There are two ways to create timelines in both verses. The first one is to change the past. If you go to the past, even a small change can result in a new timeline. This results in two timelines. The original one, where for example a character has died, and the altered one, where a time traveler saved the character and he's still alive. However, when a change in history is made, it's the duty of the Supreme Kai of Time to fix the change and set history to the way it used to be. Afterwards, the timelines that had previously split come back together and become one timeline again. And the changes in history furthermore disappear as well. The Supreme Kai of Time can also choose not to get rid of new timelines so long as she believes that it's for the best. Trunks is the sole example of this, with Supreme Kai of Time deciding to let the timelines he created linger, but there is no other known case. So with this in mind, in Heroes and Xenoverse the number of timelines is never the same. It always changes depending on how fast people go back in time and change history, and how fast Supreme Kai of Time and the Time Patrols put history back together, and it's essentially a never-ending cycle. The second way to make timelines is through Toki Toki. He hatches eggs that contain the time for a whole timeline. However, it's noteworthy that we don't know how often Toki Toki hatches eggs, and it's even more noteworthy that characters like Whis and Elder Kai, who had lived for many millions of years, consider this to be a very rare event and very important for them to celebrate. Whis even willing to fight Beerus to stop him from damaging the eggs, despite the fact that he isn't allowed to fight. This means that it's not an everyday occurrence by any means. With this in mind, we can never know for sure how many timelines there are at a time. However, we can know from arc to arc how many timelines there are if there is indication. And one such indication can be the Scrolls of Eternity, each of which represent a timeline. Knowing how many Scrolls of Eternity there are, we know how many timelines there are. In Heroes, by the time of the Ultra God mission, there are only 12 timelines in the manga at the arcade. We know this as Ios gathered teams from every single timeline, as stated, and her goal was to steal all scrolls from Eternity from the Time Nest, saying that the losing timelines will get destroyed because her goal is to only leave one single timeline to exist. This is further confirmed when, after the 9 losing teams get erased and have their 9 scrolls destroyed, we see that there are only 3 timelines left in the time box, which is said to contain each time scroll for each timeline. So with the time of the Ultra God mission, at the start there are only 12 timelines, and after the erasure there are only 3 timelines. This is consistent with Dragon Ball Super, where we see that there were 5 to 6 timelines throughout the arc. In the anime version we see more scrolls. However, we also see that a single team can contain fighters from multiple timelines, which is consistent with there being more scrolls than 12. But even so, we are told that fighters from every single timeline are gathered, and we know that there are only 84 fighters, which means that there are at most 84 timelines at the time of the Ultra God mission in the anime. And we know that her goal is still the same, so there's that. Exclusively in the manga versions of the Dark Demon Realm mission and the Big Bang mission, we see several dozen scrolls suggesting that there was a higher number of timelines back then, but again that's only for the manga continuity. In the arcade in the anime we don't see that. And since in the context they're reviewing the scrolls from each timeline to investigate, it's fair to assume that those are all the scrolls that there are. And if that's the case, that means that there are several dozens to maybe 100 timelines at the time of the Dark Demon Realm missions and the Big Bang missions. Moving on to Xenoverse, In Xenoverse 2, when all history and all scrolls begin to change, Chronoa begins to investigate all scrolls and all timelines, and we see about 18 scrolls laying on her table, suggesting that during the events of the main story of Xenoverse 2 there are about 18 timelines, and that's only after the scrolls are said to have multiplied, hinting a lower number of timelines normally. This is consistent as in Super there are only 5 to 6 timelines during the future Trunks arc. There being so little timelines also makes sense, as we know that the hero from Xenoverse and Trunks have managed to get involved in all histories. They have managed to travel to all histories and to deal with changes in the past in all histories, considering the fact that Hero's erasure affected every single timeline, and they've managed to do so in only 2 years, so the number of timelines shouldn't be too massive. Now there is the misconception that there are infinite histories based on the statements you see on the screen. However, full statements refer to singular timelines and how they are formed from countless events, not the number of timelines that exist. So this is not a statement talking about how many timelines there are. And the statement from the Time Patroller could translate to how history is endlessly branching, which is a continuous statement. It's saying how it continuously, without an end, branches off, because new timelines are constantly created by evildoers and they are later erased, but it's not saying that there are an endless number of timelines. There is also the fact that the time vault that contains the scrolls is said to be just a building and to have a limit twice, which by definition makes it finite. So if it can control the scrolls for each timeline, then the number of timelines should also be finite. Now that we are done with the timelines, we need to talk about their destruction. While destroying a timeline would qualify for low multiversal, this depends on how the timelines are destroyed. In both Xenoverse and Heroes, it's shown and stated that merely changing history causes timelines to get destroyed and to collapse, which is what Miro and Towa were doing. Another method to destroy all timelines in Xenoverse is to destroy the Time Vault. Since the Time Vault contains all scrolls, that will lead to the destruction of the timelines without the need to be able to destroy the timelines directly. We'll get into that later. It's essentially a big chain reaction. Now moving on to the power of the verse. In the Big Bang Mission manga, anime and arcade continuities, Fu needs to gather energy from throughout the universes to collect enough power for a Big Bang to create a new universe. With this in mind, Fu seems to be incapable of creating universes by himself. The same Fu scales to Xeno Goku and Capsule Corp Goku, and is even capable of fighting Vegito Blue and Super Saiyan 4 Vegito. This is backed up by the manga, where the gods of destruction mock Fu for thinking that he's capable of creating a Big Bang, saying that it's a big pipe dream, and that no mortal to their knowledge is powerful enough to do so. In the arcade and anime, well, this statement isn't present. When Fu tried to use his own energy as a source for the Big Bang, he only managed to produce an incomplete universe, which is consistently referred to as a mock universe. And that's despite the fact that the tree had already absorbed a lot of energy from throughout the universe at that time, meaning that the feat isn't purely performed by Fu's energy alone. In the Universe Mission manga and anime continuities, Hearts makes a big deal out of obtaining the power of the universe, and becomes an enemy that even Goku and Jiren stood absolutely no chance against. In the Dark Demon Realm Mission manga, Mechikabowu is able to create a black hole that sucked multiple timelines. We do not know how many timelines there were exactly at the time, but it's fair to assume that there were several dozen timelines to 100 based on the amount of time scroll we see on Chronoa's table. Keep in mind that Mechikabowu is actually much stronger than Fu, at least prior to Fu awakening Mechikabowu's power, and Fu in his own regard can fight Vegito Blue. Mechikabowu was only beaten because the character used his weakness against him, which is light energy. Although do keep in mind that this feat is manga only, and it is not present in the arcade and anime versions. So the anime and arcade counterparts for Mechikabowu do not scale to this level. Next up we have Toki Toki, whose sex are able to create timelines, and he can also make time flow. This is a level of power consistent in all of continuities. He also managed to restore all of timelines after Mechikabowu sucked them in the manga, which would amount to several dozen to 100 timelines. However, this is not base Toki Toki, this is a transformed Toki Toki. So this does not scale to base Toki Toki. And one important thing to note is that we do not know exactly how Toki Toki does these things. As from all we know, this could be done through hacks that do not scale to his physical power, much like Shenron can restore fighters way above himself. One could also argue that since Toki Toki takes a very long time to lay an egg, that must mean that he accumulates this energy to create a timeline slowly and over time. And since we do not know how long Toki Toki takes to create an egg, we cannot determine what level this feat would scale at. He is clearly accumulating that energy over time. It's not something he does in an instant. But this is all speculation. The point is that these feats are too vague and there is no concrete proof for where they scale, how long Toki Toki takes to accumulate that energy, and how Toki Toki managed to restore the timelines. And there is no concrete evidence that this scales to his attack potency, considering how he's always represented as weak and helpless. So take this with a grain of salt. Lastly, we have the Ultra God mission, in which Aios destroys 9 time scrolls, which leads to the destruction of 9 timelines. Well, one may argue that she is strong enough to destroy 9 timelines based on this. It's unclear if destroying the scrolls requires as much energy and power as destroying the timeline directly. One thing to note is that if she could destroy the timelines directly, she wouldn't have needed to steal the time scrolls. So this alone implies that destroying the scrolls is easier than destroying the timeline. There is also the fact that if you destroy the scrolls, you do not have to deal with the fact that there are dimensional barriers, the timeline barriers, and you also don't have to deal with the distance between the timelines, since the scrolls are already in your hands, and this already makes the feat way easier too. So there are multiple factors that imply that destroying the scrolls is not on the same level as destroying the timelines. And if anything, in Xenoverse it's implied that destroying the scrolls simply causes a chain reaction, and we'll get to that later. Moving on to the final point for heroes, which is that almost all characters are bound by time. Mira, Towa, CC Goku, Jiren, Broly, Xenogoku, Gogeta and Vegito, Chronoa and Aios, Demigra and Trunks, Gohan and Zamasu. Every single one of these characters, despite being top tier, is shown being affected by time. Time stops and time skips constantly are shown working against every single one of these characters. In the manga, Michikaboa, one of the most busted characters in all of Heroes, even made a big deal of obtaining the power to control time after absorbing an ancient black hole. Xenogoku and Xenogogeta, even in Super Saiyan 4, are also not able to break space-time with raw power, and needed to fuse into Gogeta to do that. Now moving on to Xenoverse. In Xenoverse, Beerus is said to be able to destroy the whole timeline and to be able to destroy the universe, making Xenoverse Beerus quite powerful. Next up we have Demigra, who absorbed Toki Toki and is said to be able to create his own history. But we do not know exactly how he was going to do so, how long he would have needed to accumulate that energy to create a timeline. So this is quite vague and it's not concrete, but it's possible timeline level Demigra. Possible. Then we have Demigra threatening to destroy the time vault, which would cause the chain reaction of the destruction of the timelines. We know that in Xenoverse, however, this chain reaction does not scale to the one causing it, as Chronoa actually states that even Demigra will be destroyed along with the timelines if he destroys the time vault, to which Demigra agrees. This implies that destroying the time scrolls does not require as much energy as destroying a timeline, at least in Xenoverse. I've seen the argument that Bardock and Mira destroyed an entire timeline during their fight in the Time Chasm, and this is based on Elder Kai saying that between Mira being knocked out by Bardock and him waking up, history disappeared and they cannot see what happened. The issue is that Elder Kai was reviewing the exact timeline the argument claim was destroyed. They were literally watching the entire fight in that timeline, and they were watching what happened after the fight. Only a very short portion of history from Bardock beating Mira and Mira waking up could not be seen by Elder Kai. Not the whole timeline. Even that is implied to be due to a time rift they created, not due to them destroying a part of history itself with their raw power. And the implication is that the time rift simply prevented Elder Kai from seeing for a bit, because again we see that the timeline was still there, it was not destroyed, they were literally reviewing the timeline. And finally we have powered up Mira, whose power could have destroyed the universe, possibly break through the wall between dimensions. It's unclear exactly what this feat entails, but it's speculated that he would have destroyed or at least heavily damaged more than one timeline, presumably all timelines. It's important to note, however, that Towa hints a chain reaction, as she says that only if Toki Toki Sec ends up being destroyed, only then are they doomed. Which would make no sense if the reason for them being doomed would be Mira directly destroying all timelines. But again, this is simply a very vague feat. We can speculate, we can claim that he would have destroyed all timelines directly, we can claim he would have only caused a chain reaction based on what Thomas said. Take this with a grain of salt, we do not know for sure. There is room for speculation here. And much like in Heroes, time stops and time skips are shown affecting Xenoverse top tiers, such as Super Saiyan Blue Goku and Super Saiyan Blue Vegeta, who scale to the Time Patroller and Mira, which would indicate that they are too bound by time. And this is it for this video. A little side note I want to make about Xenoverse Beerus. When Chronoa said that if Demigra manages to control Beerus, all of history is doomed, that does not necessarily refer to Beerus destroying a timeline directly. Because Demigra's goal was never to destroy a timeline with like a single shot to destroy it directly, it was to change history and cause the timelines to collapse. So it could refer to how Beerus as a minion can simply be used as a tool to fulfill that goal, which would end up indirectly destroying all of history through a chain reaction. So you can take this kind of with a grain of salt, whether Beerus in Xenoverse 1 is capable of destroying timelines. It can be interpreted both ways, and there is room for speculation. And in my next video I plan to talk about Victory Mission, specifically the manga, because there is an argument to be made and to be debunked about the Shadow Dragons and all that.